In 1990, a selected group of the leading American experts on Soviet Union wrote a special report to the Pentagon for the future developments of the political situation in Russia. The major conclusion of the report was the following. In 10 years, of course, we cannot expect that Soviet Union is going to become a democratic country like Sweden, but all these talks that Soviet Union can disintegrate is a total bullshit. Even in 1990, even a high-level specialist following the country on a daily basis were convinced that Soviet collapse was unthinkable. And they have, by the way, very good arguments for this. The people who got it most wrongly were the economists. Because the economists, going with their analysis, were telling everybody that the cost of disintegration is so high that it cannot happen. But listen, things happen, even when the economists believe that they're very costly. So then basically, 5 years later, in 1995, if you start reading what people have been writing about Soviet collapse, they're going to tell you that it was inevitable. Basically the same people. So something which was unthinkable 5 years ago became inevitable 5 years later. And this jump between unthinkable and inevitable was what really attracted me. So I said, listen, when we're now talking and when people are scared with disintegration and so on, it's very much important to get our fears right. If you don't know what to fear, it's very difficult to respond. The more you believe that the collapse of European Union is unthinkable, the more you are contributing to this collapse. Because then politicians started to behave differently. By the way, this is one of the reasons for the major success of some radical protest and populist parties in many countries. You are so much taken democracy for granted, European Union for granted, that normally you know that some of these people are quite idiotic, but you want to send a message to the political elite. And you are not afraid to send a message in a very radical way, because you believe nothing really bad can happen. Even if these people are going to be elected, they're going to be pressed by Brussels, they're going to be pressed by here and there, nothing really bad can happen. If you believe that nothing really bad can happen, you start to behave in a different way, in a much more risky way. In a certain way, you're pushing the system too much. And this is particularly important, because when we talk about the disintegration of the European Union, it is not very clear what we're talking about. When Soviet Union collapsed or Yugoslavia collapsed, what happened you can see on the map. There was a state, and there is not a state anymore. There are 15 new states on the Soviet case. There are 7 in the Yugoslav case. But in the case of European Union, even if it's going to disintegrate, nothing is going to happen on the map. Even more, how we're going to define disintegration. Because in the case of the European Union, the definition of disintegration is slightly like the definition of pornography. You're going to know it when you're going to see it. Misguided reforms can be more destructive than the absence of reforms. And this is quite important, because when the crisis comes, people believe that this is the moment in which they should use the crisis in order to push the agendas that have been pushing for the last 10 years and didn't manage to work. So now basically you have the federalists who believe that now is the moment to push for federal Europe. And on the other side, basically you have people who are much more believing in the nation states who said this is the moment to renegotiate it. But if the crisis is real, it does not answer the questions of yesterday, it changes the questions. For example, I don't understand anymore when somebody is telling me that we need more Europe, not less Europe. I don't know what more Europe means, and I don't know what less Europe means. This is a metaphor. This is probably good for public speech, but this is nothing, because the type of the questions has changed totally. And as a result of it, if you are basically just believing that crisis is going to help you to empower a certain vision that you had from before, I do believe that this could be one of the mechanisms of destruction. But the truth is that if, and I hope it's not going to be, because I'm not so pessimistic, but for me this is an important conversation. This is not a conversation of somebody who believes that the European Union is going to collapse. But I do believe that the European Union should be self-confident to have this conversation seriously. and not to try to pretend that this cannot happen. But basically, if this is going to happen, it is going to very much to look like a run on a bank. You basically see that other people are starting to get their money out. You see, okay, better me taking my money out just to be on the safe side. But when everybody decides to be on the safe side, the bank is collapsing. Because banks, like political unions, live on trust. And at the moment when you have a major growth of mistrust, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. When a critical number of people started to believe that the European Union can disintegrate, it will disintegrate. What is the most important is the flexibility of the system. The more rigid we are trying to make the system, the more you are increasing the risk. And here's the story, because when some of the austerity policies came up, there was a lot of criticism, mainly coming either from economists or people who basically were very much worried about the social impacts. My criticism is coming from a different perspective. What we are seeing these days in Europe is that certain part of the economic decision-making is taken out of the electoral politics. We are constitutionalizing budget deficits. We are constitutionalizing other major macro policies. But when you take economic decision-making out of politics, what remains in politics is passions. And then basically this combination of a very rigid policy system with very unstable and emotional type of a national politics, I don't believe this is a good combination. So from this point of view, rules are very important for any functioning political union, but in the time of crisis, what in my view should be maximized is flexibility.
So I will just present my little thoughts that I have on the presentation, and I think all of you then have a lot of things to say as well. Well, my story, very briefly, is a story more of integration, of course. I'm a German, and I witnessed the reunification of my country, of Germany, not the disintegration. I studied in many countries, I learned different languages. Also there, my story probably is a story of enrichment and of integration. I think, again, one example, I was sitting in a conference 2 weeks ago, and there was a young activist who spoke about disintegration, collapse in societies, and he was so aggressive and so full of anger and frustration, and he didn't see it anymore. He really, a young person living in the Ruhr district, he didn't see his community anymore. And what happened, there was a trumpet player sitting next to me, and this trumpet player, he stood up in public and he went to this young activist and he just gave him a hug. He hugged him and he sat down again. And this changed the whole atmosphere in the room. It changed the whole attitude of this young activist who almost cried when he got hugged. And you felt that this emotional link between the artist standing up, hugging this person, because he saw, he observed, he realized there was something wrong and there is some bad energy in this. I believe in good energies and the energies that are transferred. The point in this is that this for me is a moment of magic building communities, and this happens it happens a lot in the arts, it happens in the cultural field, this magic moment of reflection, of standing still, of thinking about who we are in a constructive way. And that needs time and it needs space, I think, to learn and to dare to listen, but really listen to the other. So yes, we have to be critical, I think. We have to thoroughly look into the possibility that a European Union might also not exist anymore. But I suggest rather to see Europe and the peace project of Europe as a given, as an evidence that we don't need to defend from a defensive point of view, but we need to embrace as part of progress and as something that we should shape as a very powerful tool, and we better shape it well with the right narrative behind. We should have replies to the questions, what is Europe for? And we should be constructive in dialogue between politics and citizens, and not not play this card of fear, I think, but rather play it in a constructive way.
Some people are fearful for very kind of objective reason. You cannot simply tell them, lose your fear. And the fact that we basically believe that nevertheless what's happening, they are not losers, is not helping us. You have been on this meeting, you have been studying different languages, you have been in different countries. There are people in Bulgaria who have not left their place for the last 10 or 15 years. Do you believe that one hug is going to solve the problem? I don't. I do believe that what you are saying is extremely important, but I don't believe that basically this is solving all of the problems. And just give you one story. In the beginning of the 20th century, which were the three most cosmopolitan ethnic groups that you know? The Jews, the Armenians, the Greeks. Trading people, being everywhere, being part of a kind of a different empire, being very well integrated there. If you see at the beginning of the 20th century, a major majority of these groups are very much sticked to their very ethnically defined nation states. Cosmopolitan identity is not an easy identity. Politically, it has never been. And basically trying to imagine how easy for people it is to be cosmopolitan, in my view, is not the real answer, because we can be optimistic. By the way, there is a beautiful book called Bright-Sighted by a famous American sociologist who is just studying the American obsession of being optimists. They were so optimistic that when she got cancer, she started to receive emails of people saying how happy you should be. Now you have a possibility to test your will and so on. I don't believe that when you get cancer, you should celebrate. Optimism is a very important story, but optimism cannot be the goal.
What's going to happen in this session is basically I'm going to say just a few words, then I'm going to call up each representatives of each of the workshops in turn to talk for literally about 5 minutes about what was going on in their workshop, and then give a chance to, for another 5 minutes, intervene if there's something you want to say about their particular workshop. And then let's leave 20 minutes or so at the end for a general discussion of topics rising out of those.
I'm Zachary, and I work at the European House for Culture, and we're one of the 4 offices of the A Soul for Europe initiative. And through this, we've been working on this document that you would have received today called The Decisive Deal. And through this process, we are meeting with members of the parliament, and we're developing the Berlin conference that will be held in March. And we have this opportunity to meet with them and to develop and to think about what they should work on in the agenda for the next 5 years at the EU level. And I think one of, in the last discussion, a very important that was raised was an idea of a non-linear narrative. And another link we have with A Soul for Europe is to an initiative of President Barroso and the European Commission to define a new narrative for Europe. And through this process, trying to write a manifesto to say what it means to be Europe, what it means to be European, what are Europe's values. And in our discussion, we see that on some sides, you do want to argue that there are key European values, like solidarity, equality, etc. On the global scale, you can also argue that these values exist all over the world in certain places, and we can always learn to make things better and to make more connections. And in this discussion, we talked about bar culture in Portugal and these places called tascas, pronunciations, yeah. And the idea of protection versus promotion. And at the EU level, should cultural policy focus on protection or focus on promotion? And I think this was a very nice way to close our discussion, because we arrived at the comment of Miguel, who said culture is evolving, it's dynamic, it's an evolutionary process. So maybe while the tascas needed protection in some sense, because it was where these conversations happened, just because they don't exist now doesn't mean those conversations aren't happening elsewhere. So this is an idea, I think, that links all of these points together, is that systems have to be flexible, you have to understand the context, and you have to understand that things are no longer happening in a linear function. And so by looking at all of these together and learning from each other, learning from different networked connections, and learning how things evolved, that you can better create a policy framework that lets culture thrive.
One of my key, let's say, engagements in the last 25 years have been the idea to promote the possibility of making citizen involvement on the European level possible. And we are so used often to talk about the problems we have in making this, but now since a year ago we have something which 20 years ago have been called science fiction. It's now a new territory for participatory democracy. It's the European Citizens Initiative, which is enshrined in the Lisbon Treaty and which gives 1 million people from 7 member states the same right as the European Parliament and the member states to propose new legislation. And what we have seen in these discussions today is that what is lacking, of course, that most people have no knowledge about the European Citizen Initiative, that the Citizen Initiative is not established as a powerful tool because we don't know what it will produce. And thirdly, that there is a lack of an infrastructure for this European Citizen Initiative. So in a way, we have a contrary problem to most of our projects, which starts on a local base and then create something like a dynamic. Here we have an architecture, we have an offer, we have a right, but we cannot really use it properly yet because there is no real support and infrastructure for it, and we discussed how that could be done better. That would be too much now for presenting to you, but only to say in 2 years' time, it's already decided there will be a revision of the European Citizen Initiative law, so we can influence the new legislation to become and make this tool even more efficient than it has been until now. Thank you.
What we discussed in our group was crowdsourcing democracy, a quite difficult or new topic. We had 2 presentations. We looked at the situation in the Netherlands, and then I gave a presentation about the situation in Finland. Even though we now have fairly good tools, we in Finland, for example, have developed a quite extensive e-democracy fora where you can participate during the whole law drafting process. Still, we do not always get any feedback or see where it goes. And if you yourself think of that you put in a lot of effort and then it's thrown in the garbage, would you do it again? I think this is actually the risk, that if the process tries to be transparent and participatory, but a matter of fact it's only a show that is not real, then it will actually not increase trust. The trust will decrease. So I think this is one of the fundamental things that we have to think about while we are trying to do this.
As some of the workshops already remarked, governments used to live from the past, but now since things are speeding up, the past becomes a worse and worse predictor for the days of tomorrow. And so that means that governments have to start to work from the future, which actually means effectively that they have to become designers. And so the workshop actually challenged the participants to become real designers. And so we designed stuff. We just did concrete stuff, let's say, stating that the EU is a concrete experience in the concrete daily lives of concrete people. And that if you want to change the behaviors and the notions of people that people have about Europe, you should actually create experiences in the daily lives of people. So that's what we did. Some people said that it has a danger of a top-down approach, and that it might be better to actually wait for grassroots things to come up. And then some other people said, well, if you engage in this structured way of dealing with things, designing things is a structured way, partly analytical and partly creative, of creating new experiences. It's a form of learning, and it actually deepens the quality of the stuff that you do. So even the grassroots stuff would increase in quality by using a design approach. So using social design at the level of a democracy doesn't mean that you envision a master plan for a democracy and then just create it. It might just deepen the process and create a completely different kind of reflection. The old reflection being we would study society, we would create a model, we would create a policy and then change society. The new society being stuff is happening so quickly, we can't do this royal cycle of policy making anyway. So we have to become deeply reflective practitioners, where a deepened sense of reflection is participative in continuously recreating experiences on the ground. It's a completely new way of kind of policy making and creating practices.